February 1st, 2026, 1:47 a.m. A masked figure appears at Nancy Guthrie's front door in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. The Ring doorbell camera mounted beside the entrance detects motion automatically and begins recording as the figure approaches through the darkness. 44 seconds of footage captures what happens next with crystalline clarity that will later allow FBI video specialists to extract crucial details about height and build and equipment and behavior. The suspect does not approach the door as a normal visitor would, does not knock, does not ring the bell, does not call out. Instead, the very first action upon entering the camera's field of view is directed at the camera itself. The suspect reaches toward the Ring doorbell and taps it, testing whether it will dislodge from its mounting. When tapping fails to knock the camera loose, the suspect adapts immediately, reaching for plant foliage positioned near the door and pulling leaves and branches to cover the camera lens, blocking its view. Mission accomplished from the suspect's perspective. Surveillance defeated, evidence prevented, time to proceed with whatever comes next. 41 minutes later, at exactly 2:28 a.m., according to timestamps that do not lie, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker application disconnects from her smartphone. The pacemaker, a medical device implanted surgically in her chest to regulate her heartbeat and maintain proper cardiac rhythm, communicates wirelessly through Bluetooth technology with a monitoring application installed on her phone. That application tracks the pacemaker's function continuously, monitors Nancy's heart rate and rhythm, stores data about cardiac events, and can alert medical providers if problems are detected. But that wireless communication between the pacemaker in Nancy's chest and the app on her phone requires proximity. The two devices must be within a certain distance of each other, typically 15 to 30 feet depending on obstacles and interference. Roughly the distance that would keep them connected if both are within the same house, even in different rooms. When the app disconnected at 2:28 a.m., it meant one of two things with absolute certainty. Either Nancy moved far enough away from her phone that the Bluetooth signal could no longer bridge the distance, or the phone moved far enough away from Nancy that the connection was broken. Either way, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie and her smartphone were separated by distance too great for the pacemaker to maintain its wireless link to the monitoring application. In those 41 minutes between 1:47 when the Ring doorbell camera captured the masked suspect disabling surveillance and 2:28 when the pacemaker disconnected indicating Nancy was moved or separated from her phone, Sheriff Chris Nanos and the investigators working this case understood something fundamental that would shape every single decision about how to investigate Nancy's disappearance. This was not random. This was not some criminal driving through the Catalina foothills in the middle of the night looking for any house that seemed like an easy target, any elderly resident who might be home alone, any door that might be unlocked, or any window that might be accessible. This was not opportunistic crime where the perpetrator saw a chance and acted on impulse without planning or preparation. This was not random selection where Nancy just happened to be the unfortunate person whose house was chosen from among hundreds of houses in the neighborhood. This was hunting. Deliberate, methodical, patient hunting that had been going on not for hours or days but for 8 months starting in June 2025. Nancy Guthrie was hunted like prey. She was selected as a specific target. She was researched extensively through dozens of Google searches for her address. She was studied visually through Google image searches in March and November 2025, looking for photographs of her property to analyze layout and security measures. Her daughter Savannah's salary was researched in December 2025 to assess ransom potential and family wealth. Her address was confirmed through final searches in January 2026, just weeks before the attack. Her property was observed in person during reconnaissance visits that multiple news sources reported occurred before February 1st. And on February 1st at 1:47 a.m., the hunter who had spent 8 months preparing arrived at Nancy's door to execute a plan that had been developed with extraordinary patience and discipline. The pacemaker timeline, that 41-minute window between camera and disconnection, revealed the truth not just about when Nancy was taken from her home, but about the fundamental nature of the crime itself and about the type of person who committed it. Random crimes do not involve 8 months of sustained Google searches for a victim's address. Random criminals do not spend months conducting image searches to study properties. Random criminals do not research victims' family members' salaries to calculate how much ransom might be feasible. Random criminals do not conduct reconnaissance visits, observing security measures and daily patterns and vulnerabilities. Random criminals do not purchase specific equipment like the Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack visible in the camera footage in preparation for crimes. Random criminals do not arrive at a specific house at a specific time with such confidence that they immediately disable surveillance with movements that show prior knowledge of exactly where that surveillance is positioned and how to defeat it. Everything about those 41 minutes, everything about the behavior captured in the doorbell camera footage, everything about the months of preparation that preceded February 1st, everything about the evidence patterns that emerged in the first hours and days of the investigation, screamed targeting, screamed planning, screamed hunting behavior rather than random, opportunistic crime. If you want to understand in comprehensive detail how Sheriff Chris Nanos and investigators working this case knew within 41 minutes that Nancy was hunted rather than randomly targeted, what the pacemaker disconnection at precisely 2:28 a.m. tells us about the timeline of events and about what happened inside Nancy's home during those 41 minutes between the camera being disabled and Nancy being moved far enough from her phone that the wireless connection broke. Why the distinction between random crime and targeted hunting fundamentally changes how investigations work and what evidence matters most, and where investigators focus limited resources and what types of suspects get priority, how the 8 months of Google searches starting in June 2025 and continuing through January 2026 and the reconnaissance visits and the camera knowledge demonstrated in the footage and the equipment preparation visible in the backpack all combine to prove beyond any doubt that this was methodical stalking of a specific victim selected for specific reasons. What it means that someone spent nearly a year planning to take an 84-year-old woman from her home, and why that extraordinary level of planning and patience indicates motivations that go far beyond simple robbery or random violence or opportunistic crime. How the 41-minute window connects to everything else we know about this case, from the Kia Soul spotted on a neighbor's camera at 2:36 a.m., 8 minutes after the pacemaker disconnected, to the DNA evidence being analyzed through forensic genealogy to the mixed DNA found in Nancy's home that could contain profiles from multiple people who had access to the property, to the elder abuse theory that former FBI special agents Jim Clemente and Maureen O'Connell discussed, emphasizing that elderly victims are often targeted by people who had tangential relationships through providing services or making deliveries, and why understanding that Nancy was hunted rather than randomly victimized gives investigators specific, concrete investigative paths to pursue and specific types of suspects to focus on and specific evidence patterns to look for that would not be relevant in random crimes. Then subscribe to True Crime Vault right now. This channel provides comprehensive, detailed analysis of how investigations distinguish between random and targeted crimes, how evidence patterns reveal planning and stalking behavior that occurred over months or years before crimes were executed, how behavioral analysis of suspects captured on camera shows prior knowledge versus improvisation, and how that fundamental distinction between random and targeted shapes absolutely everything from how suspect pools are defined, to what investigative techniques are prioritized, to how cases are prosecuted in court. Hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications, because this case demonstrates perfectly and tragically how investigators read evidence to understand criminal behavior and motivation and planning. And because when Nancy's case is solved through convergence of DNA and digital forensics and systematic investigation of everyone who had access to her, you will want to understand exactly how that convergence happened and what evidence made it possible. Hit the like button as well, because detailed, comprehensive analysis of investigative methodology and evidence interpretation deserves to reach everyone trying to understand how Nancy's case is being investigated and how cases like this get solved through patient, systematic work rather than through lucky breaks. And comment below with your thoughts on what the 41-minute timeline tells us about what happened inside Nancy's home between 1:47 and 2:28, what the suspect was doing during that time, and whether Nancy was conscious and mobile or whether she had been incapacitated. Now let us examine in comprehensive, exhaustive detail what happened during those 41 minutes, what the pacemaker disconnection means and what it reveals about the sequence of events, and how investigators knew immediately from the timeline and from the behavior patterns visible in the evidence that this was hunting, not random crime. The timeline is precise and unambiguous because modern technology creates timestamps that cannot be disputed or explained away. 1:47 a.m., Nancy's Ring doorbell camera detects motion in its programmed field of view and automatically begins recording as the masked suspect approaches the front door. 44 seconds of footage is captured, showing the entire approach and showing the deliberate, methodical disabling of the camera, through first tapping to test if it would dislodge, and then covering the lens with plant foliage when tapping failed. That timestamp of 1:47 a.m. is exact and verifiable because Ring cameras log when motion detection occurs and when recording begins, creating permanent records that are stored both locally on the device and in cloud systems if cloud subscription is active. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's Pacemaker monitoring app disconnects from her smartphone, indicating the devices have been separated by distance too great for Bluetooth communication. That timestamp is exact and verifiable because the monitoring app logs connection status continuously and records when disconnections occur, creating permanent records that medical device companies and phone operating systems maintain. 41 minutes separate those two precise timestamps. 41 minutes during which something happened inside Nancy's home, during which events unfolded that investigators have been trying to reconstruct through evidence analysis and through understanding what those 41 minutes would have required in terms of actions and decisions and physical movements. What can investigators deduce from that 41-minute window with reasonable certainty? What does that specific amount of time tell us about what happened and about the suspect's behavior, and about Nancy's condition, and about the sequence of events? First, and most obviously, the suspect who appeared at the door at 1:47 a.m. did not immediately grab Nancy and run out of the house as fast as possible. If the goal had been to execute a quick snatch and grab operation, to quickly overpower an elderly woman and remove her from the property in the shortest time possible to minimize risk of being seen or interrupted, the pacemaker disconnection would have occurred much sooner than 41 minutes after the camera captured the suspect. Quick snatch and grab typically takes 5 to 10 minutes maximum from approach to departure. Get inside, locate the victim, control the victim physically or through threats, move the victim to a vehicle, drive away. That sequence, when executed quickly by someone operating with urgency, can be accomplished in under 10 minutes. But 41 minutes is not urgent. 41 minutes is not rushing. 41 minutes suggests the suspect spent substantial time inside the house doing something that required more than just grabbing Nancy and leaving immediately. What could the suspect have been doing for 41 minutes? Several possibilities exist based on what we know about how these crimes typically unfold. The suspect might have spent time convincing or coercing Nancy to cooperate, time talking to her or threatening her or explaining what was happening, time getting her to gather items she would need, or time searching for items the suspect wanted to take. The suspect might have spent time physically restraining Nancy or rendering her unable to resist, time tying her up or drugging her, or incapacitating her through other means that would make her easier to control during transport. The suspect might have spent time searching the house for valuables or for specific items, time going through rooms looking for jewelry or cash or documents or anything worth taking beyond Nancy herself. The suspect might have spent time staging the scene to mislead investigators about what happened, time arranging things to make it look like something other than abduction, time creating false evidence or destroying real evidence. The suspect might have spent time simply waiting for some specific time to leave, or waiting for conditions outside to be optimal for departure, without being observed. Any or all of those activities could explain 41 minutes. What seems most likely, based on the totality of evidence, is that the suspect spent time with Nancy, time either convincing her through deception that she needed to leave with them, or time threatening her to ensure compliance, or time preparing her physically to be moved. The fact that the pacemaker did not disconnect immediately suggests Nancy remained inside the house with her phone for the duration of that 41-minute window. If the suspect had immediately removed Nancy's phone from her person upon entering the house, the disconnection might have occurred sooner, unless the phone and Nancy stayed in relatively close proximity. But the most logical interpretation is that Nancy and her phone stayed in the house for 41 minutes before Nancy was moved outside, or to a vehicle, causing the separation and the disconnection. Second major deduction from the timeline: Nancy was either mobile and able to walk, or was moved in such a way that she could be transported from wherever her phone was to a location outside the house or to a vehicle. if Nancy had been immediately incapacitated upon the suspect entering, if she had been knocked unconscious or injured so severely that she could not move or assist in any way, the suspect would have had to carry her. Carrying an unconscious 84-year-old woman from inside a house to outside and to a vehicle is physically demanding and time-consuming and risky because it requires both hands occupied and reduces mobility and creates vulnerability if anyone sees what is happening. An unconscious person being carried looks immediately suspicious in ways that a person walking, even if being coerced, does not. The 41-minute window could include time for rendering Nancy unconscious, time for preparing to move her, time for actually carrying her, time for securing her in a vehicle. That sequence is possible within 41 minutes, but it seems less likely than the alternative that Nancy was conscious and ambulatory, either cooperating voluntarily because she was deceived about what was happening, or cooperating under threat. Third major deduction from the timeline: the pacemaker disconnecting at 2:28 a.m. most likely indicates the specific moment when Nancy was moved outside the house or was moved to a vehicle. The distance required for a Bluetooth connection between a pacemaker and a phone app to break is substantial, typically requiring separation of more than 30 feet, and usually requiring obstacles like walls between the devices. Simply moving from one room to another within a house would probably not cause disconnection unless the house is very large and the rooms are at opposite ends. But moving from inside the house to outside, from the house to the driveway where a vehicle might be parked, from the house to the street, any of those movements would definitely create sufficient distance and sufficient obstacle in the form of exterior walls to cause the Bluetooth connection to break. So 2:28 a.m. is almost certainly when Nancy exited her house, when she crossed the threshold from inside to outside, when she was moved from the interior, where she had been with her phone for 41 minutes, to the exterior, where she was separated from it. Fourth major deduction: if the suspect arrived at the door at 1:47 and Nancy was moved outside at 2:28, that gives investigators a very specific window to analyze in all other forms of evidence that exist. The Kia Soul that was captured on the Ring camera of neighbors who live on Camino Real, approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's house, was recorded at 2:36 a.m., according to retired NYPD detective Pat Brosnan, who analyzed the footage and identified the vehicle. 2:36 a.m. is 8 minutes after 2:28 when the pacemaker disconnected. 8 minutes is exactly sufficient time for a vehicle to travel from Nancy's house on her street to the location on Camino Real, where the neighbor's camera is positioned. The distance is 2.5 miles. Driving that distance at moderate speed without rushing or speeding would take approximately 5 to 10 minutes depending on exact route and traffic conditions, which at 2:36 in the morning would be non-existent. So the Kia Soul captured at 2:36 becomes a vehicle of extremely significant interest because its timing aligns perfectly, suspiciously perfectly, with the pacemaker timeline. A suspect who took Nancy outside to a vehicle at 2:28, who placed her inside that vehicle or secured her in that vehicle, who then drove away from the scene immediately, would pass through the area where the Camino Real camera is positioned at almost exactly 2:36 if heading in that general direction from Nancy's house. The 8-minute gap between pacemaker disconnection and Kia Soul sighting is not coincidence. It is precisely what you would expect if that vehicle was the one used to transport Nancy away from her home. Fifth major deduction from the timeline: the specific 41-minute window helps investigators understand what physical evidence to expect to find and where to look for that evidence. If the suspect spent 41 minutes inside Nancy's house, substantial evidence of that time spent inside should exist throughout the house. Fingerprints or DNA on surfaces the suspect touched when moving through rooms, shoe prints or trace evidence on floors, items moved or disturbed or taken, signs of struggle if Nancy resisted, signs of restraint if Nancy was tied up, signs of search if the suspect went through drawers or closets, disturbance patterns that show where the suspect went within the house and what the suspect did. The blood drops that were found on Nancy's front porch, according to early reporting, indicate that injury occurred at some point, but whether that blood belonged to Nancy or to the suspect is not specified publicly. The fact that the pacemaker did not disconnect until 2:28, 41 minutes after the suspect arrived, suggests that Nancy remained inside the house with her phone, rather than being immediately injured severely enough to prevent movement. So the blood on the porch might have been from initial confrontation at the door before both suspect and Nancy moved inside for the 41-minute period, or might have been from when Nancy was moved outside at 2:28, or might have been from the suspect if the suspect was injured during any struggle or during the process of disabling the camera. The pacemaker evidence combined with the camera timestamp creates a rigid framework that investigators use to organize and prioritize all other evidence in the case. Everything that happened at Nancy's house happened within specific time boundaries that are absolutely certain. The suspect was at Nancy's door at 1:47 a.m. Nancy was moved outside or separated from her phone at 2:28 a.m. Anything that happened during those 41 minutes or immediately before or immediately after. Any evidence that shows activity during that window is directly relevant to understanding the crime. Any witness who saw or heard anything during that specific window becomes a critical witness who needs to be interviewed carefully. Any camera footage from neighbors or businesses showing vehicles or people during that window needs to be examined frame by frame. Any cell phone that pinged towers in the area during that window needs to be identified and traced to its owner. The timeline focuses everything. Subscribe to True Crime Vault if you have not already done so. Make absolutely certain that notifications are turned on. Like this video. Visit our channel for comprehensive previous coverage analyzing every aspect of this case. Comment with your analysis of what you think happened during those 41 minutes. Now let me explain in extensive detail why this 41-minute timeline combined with all the other evidence immediately told Sheriff Nanos and investigators that this was hunting rather than random crime, and why that distinction matters so profoundly for absolutely every aspect of how the investigation proceeds. Random crimes where the perpetrator selects victims opportunistically without prior planning or targeting, happen impulsively with minimal preparation, and with speed prioritized above all else. A criminal drives through a neighborhood looking for opportunities to commit robbery or assault or burglary. The criminal sees a house that looks vulnerable for various reasons that might include a window being open, or a door appearing unlocked, or an elderly person visible through a window, or the house being dark, suggesting no one is home, or the house being isolated without nearby neighbors. The criminal makes a quick, immediate decision based on assessment in the moment that this house represents acceptable risk and acceptable potential reward. The criminal enters the property quickly, gets inside the house as fast as possible, through whatever entry point seems easiest, takes whatever can be grabbed immediately that seems valuable, and leaves as quickly as possible to minimize time at the scene. Time at the scene is risk. Every minute spent inside a victim's house or on a victim's property is another minute that the victim might fight back, might escape, might call police, might be discovered by neighbors or by people driving past. Every minute at the scene is another minute that something can go wrong. So random criminals operating impulsively prioritize speed above everything else. Get in, get what you came for, get out. Total time from approach to departure in a random crime might be 5 minutes, 10 minutes maximum. 15 or 20 minutes would be extraordinarily long for a random crime and would indicate either the criminal is incompetent and disorganized and taking too long to accomplish simple goals, or something went wrong that forced the criminal to stay longer than intended. The 41-minute window between Nancy's camera capturing the suspect at 1:47 and her pacemaker disconnecting at 2:28 indicates immediately and unambiguously that this was not that kind of crime, was not random, was not impulsive, was not opportunistic. 41 minutes is an extraordinary and almost unprecedented amount of time to spend at a crime scene if you are operating randomly without planning. That amount of time indicates several things about the suspect's mindset and about the crime's nature. It indicates the suspect was extremely confident either that they would not be interrupted or discovered during those 41 minutes, or confident that even if something went wrong, they had the capability to handle it. Random criminals operating impulsively do not have that kind of confidence. They are nervous, are rushing, are constantly worried about being caught. But this suspect spent 41 minutes presumably inside Nancy's house, 41 minutes doing whatever needed to be done to prepare Nancy for removal, 41 minutes operating with a level of calm and patience that suggests prior planning and confidence born from preparation. The 41-minute window also indicates the suspect had specific goals that required time to accomplish. Those goals were not simple quick grab of valuables. Those goals involved Nancy herself involved preparing her or convincing her or controlling her in ways that took substantial time. If the goal had been simple robbery, taking jewelry or cash or electronics, that could be accomplished in 5 or 10 minutes. But spending 41 minutes suggests the goal involved Nancy, involved taking her, involved doing whatever was necessary to make that possible. That focus on the victim rather than on property is characteristic of targeted crimes, where the victim is selected specifically rather than selected randomly as whoever happened to be in whichever house looked vulnerable. But the 41-minute timeline alone is not what told investigators this was hunting rather than random crime. The timeline was one piece of evidence that fit into a comprehensive pattern that emerged in the first hours and days of the investigation. A pattern where every single piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, toward targeting, toward planning, toward hunting behavior. Let me walk through that evidence systematically to show how it all combines to create absolute certainty that Nancy was hunted. The Ring doorbell camera footage, those 44 seconds that the FBI recovered despite Nancy not having cloud subscription, shows the suspect immediately focusing on disabling the camera rather than focusing on approaching the door or attempting entry. That immediate focus on surveillance indicates prior knowledge. You do not know where a doorbell camera is located on a house you are approaching randomly for the first time at 1:47 in the morning when it is completely dark outside with no streetlights immediately nearby and limited ambient light. You would have to search for the camera, would have to look around the door area systematically to locate it, would have to figure out where it is mounted and how it is positioned. Visual search in darkness for a small device like a Ring doorbell would take time and would be visible in footage as the suspect looking around uncertainly trying to locate the camera. But this suspect did not search, did not look around uncertainly, went directly to the camera without any hesitation or uncertainty, reached for it immediately, began working to disable it. That behavior, that confidence and directness, indicates the suspect knew exactly where the camera was before arriving at the door. Knew from prior observation during conditions when the camera would be visible, meaning during daylight when the suspect had been at this property before and had seen the camera and had noted its position mentally for later use. The method chosen for disabling the camera reinforces that conclusion about prior observation. The suspect first tried tapping the device to see if it would come loose from its mounting. When tapping failed because the camera was securely attached, the suspect adapted immediately to a different method, reaching for plant foliage positioned near the door and pulling leaves and branches to cover the camera lens. That adaptation happened quickly without apparent confusion or delay, happened smoothly as if the suspect had thought through multiple possible methods and was simply moving from method 1 to method 2 when method 1 did not work. But more significantly, the use of plant foliage to cover the camera indicates prior knowledge of the landscaping and of the relationship between plants and camera position. At 1:47 a.m. in full darkness, you cannot see plants clearly enough to assess which ones are positioned close enough to the camera to be useful for covering the lens. Plants in darkness are vague shapes without detail. You cannot tell from visual inspection in darkness whether a particular plant has the right kind of foliage for covering a lens, whether branches are flexible enough to bend toward the camera, whether leaves are dense enough to block the view. But this suspect reached for those specific plants without searching, grabbed foliage, pulled it toward the camera, positioned it over the lens, accomplished the goal efficiently. That confidence and efficiency indicates the suspect had seen those plants during daylight, had observed them in relationship to the camera, had assessed their suitability for this purpose, had planned to use them if needed. That is reconnaissance. That is planning. That is not random behavior by someone encountering this property for the first time. The equipment the suspect carried, specifically the Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack that is visible in the camera footage and that FBI analysts identified by model, indicates preparation rather than impulse. Random criminals committing opportunistic crimes do not typically carry backpacks when approaching houses to commit robberies or assaults. Backpacks occupy your back, require both shoulders to carry properly, limit your mobility compared to having nothing on your back, make you more visible and more identifiable because the backpack becomes a distinctive feature that witnesses remember. Random criminals want to travel light, want their hands free, want to be able to run quickly if they need to flee. If they need to carry items away, they grab bags or containers from inside the victim's house, use pillowcases or garbage bags or shopping bags that are already there. But this suspect brought a backpack specifically, selected that backpack before leaving wherever they came from, put items inside that backpack that they thought they would need, carried that backpack to Nancy's door. That indicates planning, indicates the suspect knew they would need carrying capacity for something, indicates preparation rather than spontaneous decision-making. The specific model of backpack, Ozark Trail Hiker Pack, sold exclusively at Walmart, creates an investigative trail that would not exist for random crime. If the suspect purchased that backpack specifically for this crime or purchased it in the weeks or months before the crime, transaction records exist at Walmart showing who bought that model in the Tucson area during the relevant time frame. Credit card purchases provide names directly. Cash purchases can be traced through security camera footage showing who was at the register during the transaction and showing what vehicle they arrived in from parking lot cameras. That traceability is valuable for investigations, but it also tells us something about the suspect's planning. The suspect either did not realize the backpack model could be traced, which suggests incomplete planning or lack of sophistication, or did not care because they were confident they would not be caught, which suggests overconfidence or arrogance. Now add the Google search evidence that investigators discovered during digital forensics work in the early days of the investigation. Starting in June 2025, 8 months before Nancy disappeared on February 1, 2026, someone was conducting Google searches for Nancy Guthrie's specific street address. Not general searches for the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. Not searches for houses in Tucson. Not searches for wealthy areas where elderly people might live alone. But searches for Nancy's exact address repeatedly over a period of 8 months. That is not random. That is sustained interest in a specific location. That is someone who identified Nancy's address as significant and wanted to know more about it and kept returning to search for it multiple times over months. In March 2025, about 3 months before the address searches began, and again in November 2025, about 2 months before the attack, someone conducted Google image searches. Image searches allow you to search specifically for photographs and visual content rather than for text. Image searches for a person's address or for a property would return photos of that property, if any exist online. Photos that might show the house from various angles, that might show the front entrance where cameras are positioned, that might show the yard and landscaping, that might show windows and doors and access points. That is reconnaissance through digital means. That is someone studying the target property visually to understand layout and security before conducting in-person observation. That is planning. In December 2025, just 2 months before Nancy disappeared, someone conducted searches for information about Savannah Guthrie's salary. Savannah is Nancy's daughter, is co-anchor of the Today Show on NBC, is a nationally recognized television journalist who earns substantial income from that position. Why would someone search for Savannah's salary? The obvious reason is to assess how much money the family has, to determine how much ransom could potentially be demanded if Nancy was taken, to calculate whether taking Nancy would be financially worthwhile based on the family's ability to pay. That shows financial motivation. That shows planning around ransom. That shows the suspect was thinking months in advance about how to monetize taking Nancy. In January 2026, just weeks before February 1st, someone conducted final address confirmation searches for Nancy's location. That could be final verification before acting, could be making absolutely certain of the exact location before executing the plan, could be last-minute reconnaissance before the attack date. That 8-month timeline of Google searches from June 2025 through January 2026 is completely incompatible with random opportunistic crime. Random criminals do not spend 8 months researching a specific target. They do not conduct image searches to study properties. They do not research victims' family members' salaries to assess financial capacity for ransom payment. They do not conduct multiple searches spread over months showing sustained persistent interest. That 8-month timeline is the timeline of hunting, of a predator who identified prey and studied that prey extensively and patiently before deciding to strike. Multiple news sources, including Fox News and CBS and ABC, reported that reconnaissance visits to Nancy's property occurred before February 1st. Neighbors reported seeing someone or seeing vehicles that seemed suspicious or out of place. Investigators' analysis of patterns suggested someone had been observing the property prior to the night Nancy disappeared. Those reconnaissance visits are when the suspect would have conducted the in-person observation that could not be done through online searches alone, would have seen the Ring doorbell camera and noted its exact position, would have seen the plants near the door and assessed their usefulness, would have observed whether Nancy lived alone or whether other people were regularly in the house, would have identified what time of day Nancy was typically home and what times the house seemed most isolated without nearby pedestrian or vehicle traffic, would have observed whether neighbors were close enough to hear or see anything from Nancy's property, would have studied the best approach path that would minimize visibility from neighboring houses, would have timed how long it would take to get from a vehicle parked on the street to Nancy's door and back. All of that observation is what turns online research into actionable plan. True Crime Vault provides ongoing comprehensive analysis. Subscribe immediately, turn on all notifications. Like this video to support detailed evidence-based coverage. Visit our channel for all previous coverage. Comment with your analysis. Contact FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900 if you have information. Rewards exceeding $1,200,000 remain available. Now let me explain how all of this evidence together told Sheriff Nanos within 41 minutes that Nancy was hunted and what that means for investigation. The combination of the 41-minute timeline showing extended time at the scene, the camera footage showing prior knowledge of surveillance positioning, the equipment preparation visible in the backpack, the 8 months of Google searches showing sustained research, the reconnaissance visits showing in-person observation, all of that combines into a pattern that has only one possible interpretation. Nancy was selected. Nancy was targeted. Nancy was hunted. Someone identified her as worthy of this level of effort. Someone spent 8 months researching her. Someone visited her property multiple times to observe. Someone purchased equipment in preparation. Someone planned carefully and patiently for months. And someone executed that plan on February 1st with confidence that came from preparation. Sheriff Nanos would have seen all of this evidence in the first hours and days of the investigation. The camera footage would have been obtained immediately. The pacemaker disconnection timeline would have been determined immediately from Nancy's phone records. The Google search history would have been discovered quickly through subpoenas to Google for search records related to Nancy's address. The reconnaissance reports from neighbors would have come in through tips and interviews. All of that evidence arriving in the first hours and days creates a clear picture. This was not random. This was targeting. And that understanding, that determination that Nancy was hunted rather than randomly victimized, fundamentally changes absolutely everything about how the investigation proceeds. Let me explain why that distinction is so critical for investigative strategy and for likelihood of successfully identifying the perpetrator. When a crime is random and the victim was selected opportunistically without prior connection to the perpetrator, investigators face an enormous challenge. The suspect could be literally anyone. Anyone who was in Tucson on February 1st. Anyone who drove through the Catalina foothills that night. Anyone who saw Nancy's house and decided it looked like a good target. The suspect pool is essentially every criminal in the entire region, or even the entire country, who might have been passing through Tucson. That is millions of people. Investigating that kind of crime requires casting an extraordinarily wide net, requires reviewing security camera footage from businesses and homes throughout huge areas, hoping to spot someone or some vehicle that looks suspicious. Requires checking criminal databases for similar crimes committed in other cities, hoping to find pattern matches that might indicate the same perpetrator is operating in multiple locations. Requires essentially waiting for the suspect to make a mistake or to commit another similar crime that provides more evidence that can be connected back to this one. Random crimes are extraordinarily difficult to solve unless the perpetrator leaves obvious direct evidence that immediately identifies them. DNA that matches someone in CODIS criminal database, fingerprints that match someone with prior arrests, clear camera footage showing the suspect's face that can be compared against photo databases. A witness who saw the suspect clearly enough to provide detailed description that leads to identification. Without one of those lucky breaks, random crimes can remain unsolved for years or decades or forever because there is simply no connection between victim and perpetrator that investigators can trace. The randomness itself makes the crime nearly unsolvable. But when a crime is targeted, when the victim was specifically selected and hunted, everything changes. Targeting creates connections. The perpetrator had to learn about the victim somehow, had to identify the victim as worth targeting, had to have some reason for selecting this specific victim rather than other possible victims, had to conduct research that created digital trails that can be traced, had to observe the victim, which created opportunities for the perpetrator to be seen by witnesses or captured on surveillance cameras, had to have means and motive and opportunity that narrows the suspect pool dramatically from anyone in the world to people who had specific characteristics or capabilities or connections. In Nancy's case, the targeting is so extensive and so well documented through multiple forms of evidence that investigators can focus on a much narrower pool of potential suspects than they could if this was random. Who knew Nancy well enough to identify her as the mother of Savannah Guthrie? A connection that would not be obvious unless you knew Nancy personally or had reason to research her family. Who had access to Nancy's exact address to search for it repeatedly on Google over 8 months? Who had motivation to research Savannah's salary, suggesting financial motivation for taking Nancy? Who had opportunity to conduct reconnaissance visits to Nancy's property to observe it in person multiple times? Who had technical capability to conduct Google searches and image searches showing comfort with online research? Who had resources to purchase equipment and to travel to Nancy's house, possibly from another location if they did not live nearby? Who had time availability to spend 8 months planning this crime without that planning being interrupted by work obligations or family obligations or other life circumstances? Those questions eliminate the vast majority of the population. They focus investigation on individuals with very specific characteristics. They narrow the suspect pool from millions to potentially hundreds or dozens or even fewer. And that narrowing makes systematic, thorough investigation possible in ways that would not be possible if the suspect could be anyone. The elder abuse theory that former FBI special agents Jim Clemente and Maureen O'Connell discussed in their analysis connects directly to the hunting versus random distinction and provides specific investigative direction. Clemente emphasized that investigators should systematically examine everyone who had even tangential relationships with Nancy, people who would not be considered close to her, but who had access that created opportunity to observe her and learn about her. People who worked on her house doing repairs or maintenance. People who maintained her yard or pool. People who delivered packages to her address, whether that is mail carriers, or UPS, or FedEx, or Amazon delivery, or grocery delivery, or food delivery. People who drove her in rideshare services like Uber or Lyft. People who provided any kind of service that brought them to her house or brought them into contact with her. All of those categories of people had access that most of the population did not have. Had opportunity to observe Nancy that random people driving past her house would not have. Had ability to learn details about her life, including that she lived alone, that she was elderly, that her daughter is famous and wealthy, that she was vulnerable and trusting. That access is how hunting begins in many elder abuse cases. The hunter encounters the prey through seemingly legitimate means. A repair person comes to fix something in the house and observes that the elderly homeowner lives alone. A delivery person brings packages regularly and notices patterns about when the homeowner is vulnerable. A rideshare driver has conversations with an elderly passenger and learns information about the passenger's family and wealth. Those encounters are innocent in the vast majority of cases because most people who provide services are honest and would never exploit access. But in the small percentage of cases where the service provider has predatory intent, those encounters become the starting point for identifying victims. That tangential relationship access is how hunters find prey without the prey realizing they are being evaluated as potential victims. Nancy would have no reason to suspect that someone who came to repair her air conditioning or someone who delivered packages to her door or someone who drove her to appointments was mentally noting information about her vulnerability and her daughter's fame and her potential value as a target. Those interactions seem normal and innocent. But to someone with predatory intent, those interactions are reconnaissance opportunities disguised as legitimate service. The 8 months of Google searches starting in June 2025 could represent the next phase after initial access. Perhaps someone provided service to Nancy in May or June 2025, and during that service observed details that made them identify her as a potential target. That person leaves Nancy's house after completing legitimate work, but that person cannot stop thinking about what they observed. Cannot stop thinking about the fact that Nancy lives alone, that she is elderly and vulnerable, that her daughter is Savannah Guthrie from national television, that taking Nancy might lead to substantial ransom payment. So that person begins researching, begins Google searching for Nancy's address to confirm exact location, begins searching for images of the property to study it visually without having to return in person immediately, begins researching Savannah to understand how much money the family has. That online research phase extends over months as the person develops the plan and builds confidence to act. Then comes the in-person reconnaissance phase, where the person returns to Nancy's property, not for legitimate service but for observation, specifically planned to gather information for criminal purposes. Those visits happen during different times of day to observe patterns, happen during daylight to see cameras and landscaping and access points clearly, happen during evening or night to see how dark the area is and whether neighbors are visible. Each reconnaissance visit adds detail to the plan until the person feels ready to execute. That progression from legitimate access to online research to reconnaissance to execution is a common pattern in targeted crimes against elderly victims, and that pattern creates evidence at each phase. The legitimate access creates records because Nancy would have paid for services creating bank records or check records showing who she paid. The online research creates Google search logs that can be subpoenaed. The reconnaissance visits create opportunities for neighbors to see suspicious vehicles or people and create opportunities for cameras in the area to capture footage. The execution creates all the evidence we have discussed, from the doorbell footage to the DNA to the timeline. Sheriff Nanos told NBC News that investigators are definitely closer to identifying the suspect. That statement in itself is significant because law enforcement typically does not make statements about progress unless progress is real and substantial. Definitely closer means the systematic investigation of people who had access to Nancy is producing results. Means the pool of potential suspects is narrowing as people are investigated and either eliminated through alibis and lack of connection to other evidence, or are retained as persons of interest because they cannot be eliminated. Definitely closer means evidence is accumulating that points toward specific individuals rather than toward vague unknown perpetrators. Nanos also revealed in that same interview that investigators are facing challenges processing mixed DNA that was found at Nancy's home. The DNA does not belong to Nancy or to people in close contact with her, like family members or close friends, whose DNA would be expected in the house from normal visits. The mixture could contain DNA from several people, according to Nanos. Mixed DNA means DNA from multiple individuals combined on surfaces or in samples, requiring laboratory work to separate the individual profiles from the mixture so each can be analyzed independently. In most circumstances, finding DNA from multiple people in someone's home would not be particularly significant because it would represent normal visitors over time. Friends who touched surfaces, family who used bathrooms, guests who sat on furniture. All of that would create DNA deposits that would remain on surfaces until cleaned thoroughly. But in the context of Nancy's disappearance and the targeting evidence and the elder abuse theory, that mixed DNA becomes extraordinarily significant because it likely represents people who had access to Nancy's home through providing services. Repair people who came to fix appliances or plumbing or electrical systems would have touched surfaces throughout the house, would have left DNA on doorknobs and light switches and faucets and whatever they were repairing. Delivery people who brought items inside rather than leaving them at the door would have touched surfaces. Service providers who entered the house for any reason would have left DNA. All of that DNA from all of those people over months or years of services creates the mixture that Nanos described. The challenge of processing mixed DNA is separating the individual profiles from the mixture using laboratory techniques that can distinguish which genetic markers belong to which person. That separation is technically complex and time-consuming, but it is absolutely possible with modern forensic methods. Once profiles are separated, each individual profile becomes a lead to pursue. Each profile can be run through CODIS to check for matches against people with criminal history. Each profile can be compared against DNA from evidence like the gloves that were found. Each profile can potentially be traced through forensic genealogy if no CODIS match exists. But more importantly, in a targeted crime, each person whose DNA is in that mixture can potentially be identified through other means and then investigated systematically. Nancy's financial records show who she paid for services. Bank statements show checks, written or electronic payments made to companies or individuals. Credit card statements show purchases that might include services. All of those records create a list of people who had legitimate reason to be in Nancy's house. Each person on that list had access. Each person on that list had opportunity to observe Nancy and identify her as vulnerable. Each person on that list becomes someone investigators need to examine carefully. Investigators can interview each person on that list. Where were you on February 1st? Do you remember Nancy Guthrie? How many times did you provide services at her home? What rooms did you access? Did you observe whether she lived alone? Did you notice security measures like cameras? Did you have any conversations with her about her family or about her daughter? Those interviews serve multiple purposes. They gather information about each person's access and knowledge. They assess each person's demeanor and behavior when being questioned. They establish alibis for February 1st that can be verified or that fall apart under scrutiny. They create statements that can be compared against other evidence to see if stories match or if there are inconsistencies. Each person who had access can be asked to voluntarily provide a DNA sample for comparison and elimination purposes. Most people who are innocent and who have nothing to hide will agree voluntarily to eliminate themselves from suspicion. Those voluntary samples can be compared against the mixed DNA from Nancy's home to confirm that yes, this person's DNA is in the mixture because they provided legitimate services and their presence is explained. They can also be compared against DNA from the gloves or from any other evidence that might belong to the perpetrator. Matches to the perpetrator's DNA immediately identify that person as the suspect. Lack of matches eliminates that person from suspicion. For people who refuse to provide voluntary samples, investigators may be able to obtain court orders compelling DNA if there is sufficient evidence to justify the intrusion. Or investigators can attempt to obtain DNA through other means, like collecting items the person discards like cigarette butts or drinking cups or napkins that would contain saliva and therefore DNA. Those methods are more time-consuming, but they are possible when voluntary cooperation is not forthcoming. Digital forensics can connect people who had access to the Google searches. If investigators identify someone who provided services to Nancy and who seems suspicious based on interviews or behavior or lack of solid alibi, subpoenas for that person's internet records can show whether they conducted searches for Nancy's address. IP addresses from the Google searches can be traced to internet service providers who can identify the subscriber who was assigned that IP address at the time the searches occurred. Device identifiers like MAC addresses or browser fingerprints can show which specific computer or phone performed the searches. That digital trail creates virtually certain identification when it connects a specific person to specific searches that are directly relevant to targeting Nancy. Cell tower analysis places people at locations at specific times. Every cell phone communicates constantly with nearby towers to maintain connection to the network. Those communications create logs showing which phone was communicating with which tower at what time. By analyzing those logs, investigators can determine approximately where a phone was at any given moment. The precision varies depending on tower density, with urban areas providing location accurate to within a few hundred feet, and rural areas potentially having accuracy of a mile or more. But even rough location is valuable. If a suspect's phone was communicating with towers near Nancy's home at 1:47 a.m. or during the 41-minute window or at 2:28 a.m. or at 2:36 a.m., that places the suspect at the crime scene at critical times. Even if the suspect claims they were somewhere else, cell tower data proves where their phone actually was. And phones almost always stay with their owners, so phone location equals person location in the vast majority of cases. Financial analysis shows capability and preparation. Investigators examining suspects' financial records can see patterns that are relevant to the crime. Did the suspect purchase outdoor equipment from Walmart in the months before February 1st that could include the Ozark Trail backpack? Did the suspect take unusual cash withdrawals that might have been used for purchases they wanted to hide? Did the suspect's spending patterns change around the time of reconnaissance visits or around February 1st? Did the suspect have expenses that suggest travel to the Catalina foothills if they did not live in that area? All of those financial patterns can corroborate or contradict other evidence. Vehicle tracking through automated license plate readers, traffic cameras, business security cameras, toll systems, and other sources can show whether a suspect's vehicle was in the Catalina foothills on February 1st. If investigators identify the Kia Soul captured at 2:36 a.m., Registration records immediately show who owns that vehicle. If the owner is someone who had prior access to Nancy through providing services, that connection becomes extraordinarily significant. Even if the specific vehicle is not identified, if a suspect's vehicle is captured on any camera in the area during the 41-minute window or shortly after that places them at the scene and contradicts any alibi claiming they were elsewhere. Forensic genealogy can identify suspects even when their DNA is not in CODIS because they have no criminal record. The DNA from gloves or from mixed DNA in Nancy's home can be uploaded to public genealogy databases where millions of people have voluntarily submitted DNA to find relatives. The investigative profile gets compared against those submissions looking for genetic matches that indicate shared ancestry with the suspect. Those matches are typically distant relatives, third or fourth or fifth cousins who share common ancestors with the suspect several generations back. Forensic genealogists then build family trees using traditional genealogical research methods, working backward from the genetic matches to identify common ancestors, and then working forward through all the descendants of those ancestors to identify everyone alive today who could potentially be the source of the DNA. That list of potential sources gets filtered by everything known about the suspect from other evidence. Age range from the camera footage. Sex presumably male based on build and height. Location likely in or around Tucson. Physical characteristics like the black mustache visible despite the mask. That filtering narrows the genealogy candidate list to a manageable number of people who can then be investigated individually through all the methods described above. The convergence of all these investigative methods is what leads to identification with certainty. DNA genealogy might produce a candidate list of 20 people who could potentially be the DNA source. Digital forensics might show that one person on that list conducted Google searches for Nancy's address. Cell tower analysis might show that person's phone was near Nancy's home during the 41-minute window. Financial records might show that person purchased an Ozark Trail backpack from Walmart. Vehicle tracking might show that person's car in the neighborhood on February 1st. Interviews might reveal that person provided services to Nancy, giving them legitimate access. Each piece of evidence independently is suggestive and creates suspicion, but combined, all pointing to the same individual through completely independent methods, they create certainty beyond any reasonable doubt. This is how targeted crimes get solved when random crimes might remain unsolved. The targeting creates connections. The connections create evidence. The evidence creates trails that investigators can follow systematically. And those trails converge on one person when that person is actually responsible because evidence from multiple independent sources does not accidentally point to the same innocent person. Nancy Guthrie was hunted for 8 months. The evidence of that hunting is extensive and undeniable. Someone researched her address for 8 months. Someone conducted image searches studying her property. Someone researched her daughter's salary to assess ransom potential. Someone conducted reconnaissance visits observing the property. Someone purchased equipment in preparation. Someone knew where the camera was positioned from prior observation. Someone arrived at 1:47 a.m. and spent 41 minutes in her house before removing her at 2:28 a.m. All of that is hunting behavior. All of that is targeting. And Sheriff Nanos knew within 41 minutes, knew from the timeline and from the behavior patterns emerging in evidence, that this was not random, but was methodical hunting. That knowledge shapes absolutely everything about the investigation, shapes where resources are focused, shapes what evidence is prioritized, shapes what types of suspects are examined most carefully, and shapes the confidence investigators can have that systematic, thorough work will lead to identification, because targeted crimes create the very evidence that investigators need to solve them. Nancy has been missing for over 5 weeks since February 1st. The search for her continues every day. The investigation continues every day with interviews and DNA analysis and digital forensics and systematic elimination of people who had access. Sheriff Nanos saying definitely closer is not empty rhetoric. It reflects real progress through real investigative work following the trails that the targeting created. The person who hunted Nancy for 8 months left evidence throughout that entire 8 months. That evidence exists in Google's servers, exists in cell tower logs, exists in financial records, exists in surveillance footage from Walmart and from neighbors' cameras, exists in DNA. All of that evidence is being systematically traced back to identify the hunter. True Crime Vault will continue covering this case until Nancy is found. and until the person who took her is identified and arrested and prosecuted. Subscribe for ongoing comprehensive analysis of evidence and investigative techniques. Turn on all notifications for immediate updates. Like this video to support detailed evidence-based coverage. Visit our channel for all previous comprehensive coverage. Comment with your analysis of what happened during those 41 minutes and what you think the suspect was doing inside Nancy's house. And if you have any information, if you provided services to Nancy, if you delivered to her home, if you drove her anywhere, if you remember seeing anything suspicious near her house in the months before February 1st, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900 immediately. Your information might be exactly what investigators need to complete the convergence and identify who hunted Nancy Guthrie. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. Her family deserves answers and deserves justice. And understanding that she was hunted rather than randomly victimized, understanding that someone spent 8 months planning to take her, understanding what the 41-minute timeline reveals about the execution of that plan, all of that understanding focuses the investigation and increases the likelihood that the systematic work being done will lead to identification and to the accountability that Nancy and her family deserve.